Plasma is mostly water, so let's focus on water right now. How does water move? Water moves for two reasons. One, a physical pressure on the fluid itself. This would be hydrostatic pressure, shown here in the picture. You are seeing a bottle of water. The water inside the bottle is exerting an outward pressure on the plastic bottle. Similarly, the plastic of the bottle is exerting an inward pressure on the water inside. One of the things I like to do to my kids is take a bottle of water, and I say to them, as I'm holding it upright, "Mommy can make the water come out of this bottle without tipping it upside down." I then tell my kids to get really, really close to the opening of the bottle, and then I squeeze as hard as I can on the bottle, and it comes shooting out in their faces. It's great fun. So that's a perfect example of hydrostatic pressure. This type of pressure explains why plasma will move through the intercellular clefts of the endothelial cells of the capillary and then into the interstitial space. But this type of water movement does not explain the driving force for water going across individual cell membranes, meaning passing from outside the cell to the inside of the cell or vice versa. Hydrostatic pressure and also osmotic pressure imbalance, both of them, can explain why we are going to see shifts of fluid coming out of the capillaries and eventually ending up in special places like the peritoneal space. And this has everything to do with what's called, quote, third spacing. Let me explain. In some of the old medical texts, the first space referred to is the body fluid compartment. The largest of them all, of course, would be inside the cells, intracellular fluid. So that intracellular fluid was considered to be the first space. The second space was the fluid in between the cells, or interstitial fluid. The third space refers to the transcellular spaces. Spaces lined by epithelial cells like synovial cavities, but most notably the peritoneal cavity. And that's something that I'd like to discuss more in the next few slides. What is osmotic pressure? It is the force to explain water shifting from one side of the cell membrane, to the other. It is a difference in particle count per unit volume. Let me explain. When I was pregnant with my youngest child, I had gestational diabetes, and I was watching my glucose intake, and one of my favorite drinks to have was Crystal Light. And my oldest child, Hayden, he always loved to make my Crystal Light for me. One day he said to me, "Mommy, my do it, Mommy, my do it," which meant I'll do it. So he goes to the kitchen, and I can hear him rummaging around, and I can hear him stirring and stirring and stirring the water. And he finally brings me a glass of Crystal Light. I took a drink and instantly spit it out across his face. Just kidding, but it was close. And what he had done was taken a whole entire tub of Crystal Light and poured it into a glass, and then filled the glass with water. Of course, we recognize that this is a very concentrated solution. He should have poured it into a pitcher and added significantly larger volumes of water to dilute it. But let's take that story and apply it to osmotic pressure. If we made a normal pitcher of Crystal Light, we would take the tub of Crystal Light particles and we put it in a pitcher and then bring the water up to the top of the pitcher and stir. If we poured a glass from that larger container of Crystal Light into our glass and we drank it, we would recognize that we were drinking the same number of particles per unit volume as what was in the original pitcher. It didn't change just because we poured our solution from a larger container to a smaller container. It doesn't mean we changed the concentration. However, let's say we wanted to make just a glass of Crystal Light using the powder in the tub. Would we dump the entire tub in the glass? No. We would reduce the amount of powder proportionally to match the reduced volume of water that we are going to add to the glass in comparison to the pitcher. So an osmotic force or pressure is created when and if there are unequal particles of solutes across a cell membrane per unit volume. And these particles cannot move across the cell membrane. They are impermeable. If we have a more concentrated solution in the extracellular fluid compared to the intracellular, then the water will move through the cell membrane by osmosis to the area with the highest particle count. Particles suck, as I like to tell my students. Now, these shifts of water in our patient's body fluid compartments can be very drastic. They are very quick and can easily lead to death. A perfect application of osmotic pressure can be appreciated if we consider a plasma osmotic pressure being maintained by the plasma protein albumin. And when albumin particle count decreases, we are going to see that this will lead to large shifts of fluid from one compartment to the next, and our patient will be, quote, third spacing. Let me explain on the next slide. If you review your capillary hemodynamics lecture from physiology, for some of you this might have been decades ago, you'll remember that when blood first enters a capillary at the arterial end, the capillary blood pressure is much higher than the capillary osmotic pressure. The capillary osmotic pressure is created by the amount of albumin dissolved in the plasma. There is a fight of pressure across the capillary membrane. There's capillary hydrostatic pressure, and there's interstitial fluid hydrostatic pressure. Then there's capillary osmotic pressure, and then there's interstitial osmotic pressure. Of all four pressures, the largest two are capillary blood pressure and capillary osmotic pressure. The capillary osmotic pressure is made or created mostly by albumin. Albumin levels should be maintained at a steady state, shown here as a red dashed line. However, blood pressure across a capillary drops. It's higher at the arterial end, as shown here by the green line designated as capillary blood pressure. If you look down at the x-axis, you see arterial end has a higher capillary blood pressure, and then the blood pressure drops as it goes towards the venous end. When there is higher capillary blood pressure than osmotic pressure, there is filtration. There is a net loss of blood plasma to the interstitial space. This is great because it brings renewed, fresh nutrients, but as the blood pressure drops, then the capillary's osmotic pressure will be higher, and this will favor reabsorption. So you get some of that lost fluid back into the blood vessel. This facilitates the waste products, or facilitates the waste removal from tissues. Now, why is albumin and our discussion on osmotic pressure a perfect application or relationship to each other? Well, note this poor child's swollen, distended belly. She actually has a protein deficiency. She has kwashiorkor, which means disease of displaced or deposed child. And it basically means, loosely translated, that the child is no longer being breastfed. So now the child is put on a solid diet. Typically, they are eating a diet that is deficient in one of the essential amino acids, say, for example, tryptophan. So what happens is her liver cannot sustain adequate amounts of albumin. Albumin is a particle, and a significant particle in the plasma, that helps contribute to the particle count. Going back to my crystal light story, that would be the equivalent of my child not adding enough crystal light to the pitcher. So she doesn't have enough particles, specifically albumin. This is because she is deficient in amino acid intake and she can't make her own proteins properly. That means her blood plasma compartment has a reduced osmotic pressure, fewer particles per unit volume. And her peritoneal cavity, which is filled with fluid, a different kind of fluid, transcellular fluid, is not having this problem with particle count. So prospectively speaking, it now has more particles per unit volume compared to the plasma. And therefore, this is going to create an osmotic effect. The water from the plasma compartment is going into the peritoneal cavity, causing the distension of her belly. She is not full. By no means is she full and feeling satiated from her meal. She is experiencing ascites, this edema in her belly. If you look at her feet, you can also see that the gravitational pull of her blood to her feet increases capillary blood pressure, and this is going to help drive the blood from the plasma compartment into the interstitial space. But also, because her plasma has reduced albumin, that means that her plasma water content is again, additionally, being driven into the interstitial space, attracted to the greater particle concentration. You don't have to go to a third world country to see kwashiorkor. You can see this in the elderly in hospitals, in nursing homes, because, well, quite frankly, the elderly can be really picky about what they eat. They can be deficient in certain amino acids, certainly at the nursing home. You can also see this in a severe alcoholic where they are not taking adequate amounts of protein and possible cirrhosis causing a lack of hepatocytes to make albumin. It's time to shift gears from the proteins in the blood plasma to how we assess them and how we can monitor them, because obviously from this discussion I just held with you, albumin is significantly important. It's an important protein in the blood plasma. I'd like to briefly give you a sample of some acid-base chemistry. I know at this point half of you were my previous physiology students, and you have heard this before, but I'm hesitant to assume that the other half of the class has had A, chemistry, and B, a discussion of Zwitter ions and isoelectric points in their physiology class. So if you have not had a chemistry class, or it's been a while, these next 2, 3, 4 slides might scare you terribly, but this is not going to be a huge focus on your lecture exam. It's just me trying to review, so take a deep breath and just bear with me. First of all, an acid and a base will react with each other and neutralize each other. An acid will increase the hydrogen content in the solution. Actually, it's hydronium ion. An example of a base would be something that increases the hydroxyl content, or OH. So the positive hydrogen ion would react with the negatively charged hydroxyl group to create water, a neutral substance that has a pH of 7.0. So in this picture in the top right, you are seeing the structure of an amino acid. An amino acid has a central carbon. They all have at least one hydrogen attached to the central carbon. They all have an amine group, and they all have a carboxyl group. And then they all have a fourth attachment that is random. It's called their functional group. And based on whatever molecules are attached to the carbon in the function group will dictate the chemistry of that amino acid. So tryptophan, for example, has a different functional group than glycine. The pH at which a single amino acid exists as a neutral molecule is called a Zwitter ion. So in this case, you are seeing a picture of a Zwitter ion. You're seeing a positively charged amine group and a negatively charged carboxyl group. If I were to take this amino acid and apply an electrical field, neither of the charges would dominate. The amino acid would not move in this electrical field. An isoelectric point refers to an entire large protein. It basically reflects that the protein as a whole has a neutral charge. It's electrically neutral. That means there's no net gain or loss of charges. It might have some amino acids with a functional group that has more amine groups that are positively charged, or it might have some amino acids with functional groups that have more carboxyl groups that are negatively charged. But overall, these plus and negative charges would neutralize each other. As such, a protein at its isoelectric point would not move in an electrical current. Now, when it comes to a medical laboratory, if we are assessing patients' plasma proteins, one of the tests we do is take some plasma and we put the plasma on a piece of paper called nitrocellulose and we apply an electrical current. We separate albumin from the globulins from the fibrinogen. We can separate the proteins. In order to separate them, the proteins that we are getting from the patient in the plasma cannot be at their isoelectric points. So we have to put these proteins in a very basic buffer. And what you're seeing down here in the bottom square is that if we take proteins that have an acid group, shown here as the AH, and we put them in a basic buffer, say a pH of 8.8, then the hydrogen ions will dissociate, and this will leave behind the molecules that have an overall negative charge. This protein will most certainly now separate in an electric field. It would migrate differently compared to other negatively charged proteins. To put it in another way, you'll see here down at the bottom of the screen I have a Zwitter ion with a positive charge amine group and a negative charge carboxyl group. If I put it in a basic solution, shown here as the OH negative, notice that the amine group loses one of its hydrogen ions. This means we lose the overall positive charge and we are left only with a negatively charged carboxyl group. This represents an amino acid that is no longer a Zwitter ion, and it most certainly would move in an electrical current. Similarly, we could take a Zwitter ion and put it in an acidic buffer. This would drive hydrogen ions onto the carboxyl group. We would lose the overall negative charge, and now just the amine group with its extra positive charge would exist. This is no longer a Zwitter ion, and it too can move in an electrical current. So we have choices. We could take the patient's plasma and put the plasma either in a basic buffer to make them more negatively charged, or we can put them in an acidic buffer to make them more positively charged. It turns out that because our blood pH is already slightly basic, we stick to the basic buffer. We put the proteins in an even more basic buffer to make them as negatively charged as possible, and then we apply an electrical current. When we put the protein on a piece of nitrocellulose paper and apply an electrical current, you'll see here that if the proteins were put in a buffer that was very basic, shown here as a deep purple with a pH of 10, that overall the proteins would be deprotonated and they would be negatively charged. And therefore the proteins would travel towards the positive part of the electrical source. They would travel toward the anode. If, however, we put the proteins in a very acidic buffer, then the proteins would be highly protonated and therefore positive, and so these proteins would move to the negative pole or cathode. If proteins are neutrally charged, then they would not have any net migration to any pole of the electrical source. When do we do such a manipulation in a clinical setting? We manipulate plasma proteins from patients in order to perform the serum protein electrophoresis, electrophoresis, or SPE. We put the proteins in a very basic buffer of about 8.8, and this makes the plasma proteins very negative. We put them on a piece of nitrocellulose, and we apply an electrical current. We will put the two ends of the cellulose in the buffer, and as the electrical current flows, the proteins will be separated. Here is a typical profile of an SPE, or serum protein electrophoresis. The most abundant plasma protein, as I said before, is albumin. It's going to have the largest band. The next band to your right is alpha-1 globulin. This consists mostly of an enzyme known as antitrypsin. Then the next band will be alpha-2 globulin, which are primarily your macroglobulin and haptoglobulin. The next band will be your beta globulins, and it includes your beta 1 and beta 2 globulins. The last band is your gamma globulins, your immunoglobulins. You know, your IgGs, IgAs, IgEs, IgMs, and IgDs. And I'm sure you remember these from micro. You remember things like M for mega because it was really big and had 10 binding sites. You remember things like IgA for saliva and tears and sweat, and all of those had the letter A in them. So they are body secretions, body surface secretions. Now, these proteins, here's the thing, they're supposed to be in a normal ratio. Most importantly, there is a ratio between albumin and the gamma globulins. Albumin is in the numerator and the gamma globulin is in the denominator. So obviously, if you're looking at this normal picture, the albumin part is much larger than the gamma globulin. So the fraction that you get between the two of them will be slightly larger than 1. What is significant about this? The width of the bands can be diagnostic. They can indicate a number of conditions that the body or the patient may be suffering from. It all relates to the albumin globulin ratio. Again, albumin being larger, this is going to be a normal value of higher than 1. Albumin is much larger than any of the other protein fractions. So we want the Ag ratio. Different diseases will have varying Ag ratios. The densitometer, this is a machine that can shine light at these bands, and depending on how dark they are, the densitometer will measure how much light was transmitted through those bands. Less light means thicker, darker band, which means more protein. If a patient had a high gamma globulin fraction, a higher than normal gamma globulin fraction, then our ratio would actually decrease. This would be indicative of some sort of infection, right? Because that is what our gamma globulins or immunoglobulins would be fighting. That's one of the more common uses that we use the electrophoresis for, is to see this Ag ratio. I'm going to show you again a normal electrophoresis pattern in the top picture, and in the bottom picture I'm showing you an abnormal electrophoresis pattern. Again, this SPE is a total protein test. It is often ordered as a routine health checkup. Total protein may also be ordered to provide general information about a patient's nutritional status, such as when you might have undergone a recent weight loss. This test can also be ordered along with other tests to provide information if you have a patient that might suggest liver or kidney disorder. Because if the liver or kidneys are failing, this too can explain edema. Low total protein levels can suggest a liver disorder, as I mentioned before. The liver is responsible for making albumin. A kidney disorder, if the kidney is not secreting enough sodium or retaining enough water, and this can lead to a problem with the protein concentration. Another example, if the kidney filtration membrane is damaged and protein is being filtered and lost in the urine, then the amount of protein in the blood would decrease. Still some more examples. We can see low levels in severe malnutrition and with conditions that cause malabsorption, such as celiac disease, liver disorders, kidney disorders, etc. We can see high total protein levels with chronic inflammation or infections. Again, the IgGs would go up because of that chronic inflammation. The cytokines would cause more of these plasma proteins to be produced. So laboratories are going to report the Ag ratio, or albumin, to gamma globulin ratio. As I said, a low Ag ratio may reflect an overproduction of gamma globulin or loss of albumin, and a high Ag ratio is going to suggest underproduction of immunoglobulins, maybe as a result of various white blood cell disorders. Well, this concludes our lecture on the hematopoiesis process. I hope you enjoyed it.